Well, I asked and everyone answered, so to follow up my review of the Devil May Cry trilogy, I'm back to review Devil May Cry 4 and DMC Devil May Cry. At first, I wasn't sure if I'd be able to get this review out in time before Devil May Cry 5 came out, but here we are. Not because of DMC4, but because I've never actually played DMC before, but this gave me the perfect opportunity to finally give it a chance and give DMC4 another playthrough. If you didn't see my previous video, it comes highly recommended as I gave my opinions on DMC 1, 2, and 3. In short, I thought all 3 were enormously fun to play, even though 1 was a bit dated, 2 is inherently flawed, but 3 is one of my favorite games. Having said that, let's get into Devil May Cry 4 Special Edition for the PlayStation 4. All 3 games in the trilogy sold extremely well, but the 6th generation was done as the HD consoles hit the scene. Capcom got the team to work on Devil May Cry 4, only this time they wanted to expand the audience by releasing the game on the PlayStation 3 and the Xbox 360. Since this choice was made, Devil May Cry has become a multi-plat franchise, with Microsoft oddly being the one to announce and promote Devil May Cry 5. Really though, I'm sure this was probably done since the 360 was a far more popular console in the early 7th gen than the PS3. Either way, I don't own DMC4 on PS3 or 360. A few years ago, Devil May Cry 4 hit the PS4 and the Xbox One as Devil May Cry 4 Special Edition with added characters, cutscenes, and costumes. This is the version I'm going to be focusing on for the review. So let's start with the plot. DMC3 really raised the bar for the stories in these games, and one would hope that DMC4 would continue to do the same. Well, we start with a church of people worshipping Sparta, which right off the bat is a really cool idea since he's done so many incredible things, it would only make sense for him to have a religion. This is when we're introduced to the new main character, Nero, the rebellious youth who doesn't care about the lecturing and the philosophy. He just likes Kyrie. A fact the game will make damn sure you remember. Things get interesting when Dante descends from the glass above and murders the head priest, Sanctus. Nero quickly battles Dante as it's revealed that Nero has strange demonic powers surging through his right arm. The Order then sends Nero out to find and capture Dante for his crime, but as you play it's revealed that the members of the Order are demonic themselves as Sanctus is revived. They want to bring the giant statue, the Savior, to life. Nero looks for Dante, but in the process uncovers more of the Order's plans and fights against them, as it's also heavily implied that Nero is the descendant of Virgil in a really cool scene where he awakens his devil trigger for the first time. After that, the Order tries to use Kyrie as the sacrifice for the Savior. Nero tries to save the day, is captured himself, and Dante has to then pick up the slack as he frees Nero, allowing for him to save Kyrie as the Order is defeated and the Savior is destroyed. Dante and his friends leave, Nero and Kyrie love each other, and that's basically it. The story in this game is pretty boring, unfortunately. Again, DMC plots outside of 3 were never great, but with this being the sequel, you would hope the quality standard would remain pretty high. DMC4's story is not terrible, but it's just not that interesting. Outside of scenes like Dante in the opening, Nero in his devil form, and basically any scene with Dante, I wasn't very interested. This starts with the new character, Nero. I liked Nero even when I first played the game. I always thought he was a decent character with a witty personality I could get behind. However, for the first half of his campaign, he's just out on a mission from the Order, and then he wants to save Kyrie, which he's abducted. So all of his motivation is just centered on her, but then you as a player don't care about that since there's nothing remotely appealing about Kyrie as a character. I mean, seriously, if you asked me a single personality trait she had other than caring about people, I would struggle to give you one example, since she's just Nero's motivation. A motivation with no depth. A far cry from all the previous female leads in the trilogy. Since I didn't really care about Nero's mission on my first playthrough, I basically kept watching the cutscenes hoping Dante would show up. And he didn't disappoint. Despite being set after DMC 1 and 2, Dante in DMC 4 is just an older, even cooler version of himself from DMC 3, and I just can't get enough of him in his dialogue. It's just so entertaining.
You can hide that body, but that smell? Ooh, there's no covering up. Wish you would have noticed me earlier. Now my coat's all charred.
Such a great character. It makes sense that he doesn't have the highs and lows that DMC3 Dante did, since he is so much more experienced now than he was then. However, Dante becomes the main character of the story for almost a third of it, and yet he has no real arc himself, since he's basically just here to stop the bad guys. Not much more to it than that. He does recover Virgil's sword, Yamato, and gifts it to Nero at the end, which is a great moment, but other than that, Dante doesn't serve much of a deeper function in this story beyond being entertaining, since they knew you'd want to play as him and not Nero. Trish and Lady are also here, and they especially have almost nothing to do other than helping Dante off screen. Even though I do love the ongoing interaction between Dante and Trish especially. I think the problem of DMC4's story is most prevalent in the game's villains. The members of the Order are just not threatening like Mundus or Arkham especially. Nor is anyone unintentionally comedic like Arius. But yeah, there's no earth-shattering plot twist that changes everything, and I mean, there are twists, but nothing exciting. The stakes don't feel very high, it's just kinda there. That's basically my stance on the story of Devil May Cry 4. It's perfectly fine, but it's just bland and has nothing on DMC3. Even if the story itself wasn't that great, it certainly is well presented. The cutscenes in DMC4 look fantastic, with a wide variety of motion capture shots surpassing DMC3, with top-of-the-line voice acting and graphics of some of the best the early 7th gen had to offer. There are only 4 areas in DMC4, but they're rich in detail, color, have great lighting and atmosphere, and to top it all off, the game runs at 60 frames per second, when numerous games at the time could barely keep 30. So on the subject of the gameplay, to ease newcomers in, we play as Nero for a majority of the game. I'm perfectly fine with this. I mean, if you play like a Devil May Cry character, then you're good in my book. Nero and Dante both control really well in DMC4 with the same control scheme as previous games, only it just feels smoother now than it did before. It's one of my favorite new abilities, being able to sprint if you've been moving for a few seconds straight. So when playing as Nero, you have his sword, Red Queen, with several cool combos like slamming onto the ground several times, or the Stinger, which has a much wider range than Dante's since it's more of a spread than anything else. In fact, a lot of Nero's attacks feel more spacious, covering more enemies, like this spinning upward slice you do if you time it right when juggling enemies. Red Queen can also be revved up to 3 levels for faster attacks and additional damage, although the cool challenge is figuring out how to keep the style up in the middle of combat while also not taking damage from enemies despite being vulnerable. A few missions in, Nero finds Yamato and unleashes his DT, and it's really cool as you do all the same attacks but the effects are doubled. I also like how activating Nero's DT isn't an attack in and of itself. Taunts still add to your DT and your style. Basically all the great improvements from DMC3 have stuck for the most part. Nero also uses his revolver type gun, the Blue Rose. Again, I mostly just use this for chip damage since it doesn't function that differently from Ebony and Ivory. It's just instead one gun that you can charge up for a slightly more powerful shot, although with the damage output it's not really worth it. Nero's arm, the Devil Bringer, is his true core gimmick, and with it he can grapple onto objects and pull enemies closer to him. When you just use it to grab an enemy up close, you can use them as a demon shield or slam them to the ground or smack them around with other enemies. Grabbing enemies from afar eliminates Nero's need for a style like Trickster since he just brings enemies to him and that's the coolest part. Although, from my experience, there isn't much variety to the Devil Bringer since what you do to enemies is already determined. Knights get their swords thrust back into them, frost guys get tossed around, that sort of thing. But it is at its best during boss fights where you've got guys almost defeated and then you grab the giant demon and send them flying. It's just so cool. Especially during the Credo and Sanctus boss fights where you have to actually time it right. This is what I was talking about in my Metal Gear Rising review. I'll always take this for spectacle over QTEs since I'll still mess this up from time to time, but that's the beauty of skill-based gameplay. So yeah, Nero plays really well. However, I have to admit that for a character you play as for 13 missions out of 20, it gets a bit old. I'm never not having fun as Nero, it's just that he never gains new weapons or a new gun, so while unlocking additional sword combos is good and all, the 3 methods of attacking foes just starts to lose some luster by the end. To make up for this, some Nero stages have other elements to increase the variety, like grappling on grapple points, which is really good since it starts out easy and then gets more complicated by the end, a fine scale, but I don't like playing this dice game to get Nero across the board. Once you figure out the trick where the number on top will be the number you get, it just becomes kind of mindless, but before that it's just tedious. So I love when Dante just destroys the thing. Nero also spends a stage winding these things up and sending them flying into the direction he needs them to go in, and it's not bad, but it's the kind of thing where you just realize the solution before the game gets you there. So in conclusion, I like playing as Nero, but I don't think it's great, and if it was just him, then DMC4 would just be okay as far as action games go. But then, Nero is captured and Dante takes over for a few stages. I'll go out and say that Dante in Devil May Cry 4 is easily one of my favorite characters to play as in a video game. Everything from the controls, the fluid animations, the beautiful taunts, the most importantly, the best improvement from DMC3 to 4, style switching. That's right, Trickster, Swordmaster, Gunslinger, and Royal Guard are available at once, only taking one switch of the D-pad in order to use. So say an enemy is a little far away, switch to Trickster, dash over to them, switch to Swordmaster and start slashing and jump canceling. When the enemy starts to fall, switch to Gunslinger and shoot them from above. Dante is fun right off the bat in DMC4, but it's because of the style switching that makes Dante have such an unbelievable skill ceiling. Like, you'll watch footage of people playing as Dante in DMC4 and they just fly across the screen using a Royal Guard, Trickster, Swordmaster combo. Trying to master Dante will take you a long time, but it's such a rewarding process since, like I just said, he's an inherently fun character to play as, so you're gonna enjoy it every step of the way. The styles Quicksilver and Doppelganger have been removed, but I don't think that's a bad thing since those are late game bonuses when the core tenets of the style system in DMC3 was in the 4 we have in this game. I'm still not that good at using Royal Guard though, but as I basically established, a lot of the great mechanics like jump cancelling are here and accounted for in DMC4 and are just as much fun to use as in DMC3. Although there are some things you can't do like riding on enemies, which is a shame, but then there's a new style you can unlock when Dante retrieves Yamato. The Dark Slayer style, where he can use the sword for some effective airstrikes and for a flurry of strikes crowding the screen. Although the damage output is a little low on this one, so I don't use it as much, but does come in handy from time to time. One area that's a downgrade from DMC3 is Dante's weapons, which were all some of my favorites in the gaming in the last game, but here we have Rebellion, which is basically the same as before, Ebony and Ivory, and the shotgun. In the DMC5 wishlist video, I praised having the ability to switch between all of Dante's weapons, but at the same time, there's only 3 guns and 3 devil arms in this game anyway, so they probably figured there wouldn't be a point to a 2 at a time system. You unlock Gilgamesh, the hand-to-hand combat, which isn't as fast and fun to use as Beowulf, but it's basically the same thing, functionally speaking. I do like the DMC1-esque fire jump and fire kicks, though. You then unlock Lucifer, which seemed really weird my first time, but basically you create these tiny swords that you stab into enemies and then set them off like a bomb when pulling back on the analog stick and pressing the attack button. It's the one that I use the least, but it can be helpful every now and again, or if I'm just trying to change the pace since I mostly use Rebellion to begin with. Dante's third gun, Pandora's Box, is great though. With this thing you shoot missiles, homing missiles, a giant laser, and so many more. It just takes up so many forms, which makes up for having less guns since it's more useful than a lot of the guns in the trilogy to begin with. However, the limited amount of devil arms is disappointing since DMC3 had such a great and balanced selection. So while Rebellion's mostly the same, Gilgamesh is just the worst Beowulf, and Lucifer is just fine, overall in this regard, DMC4 is disappointing. But all this stems from the fact that DMC4 just screams rushed. Dante's levels are just Nero's levels but in reverse, as you literally have to go back to the starting point of the game to challenge the savior. For this reason, Dante's levels don't feel like they were designed for him. You just sort of run through areas fighting enemies with all the gimmicks removed, which is sort of good, but then it's also lame since Dante gets this rushed campaign with no time to enjoy his abilities. We have to fight the exact same boss as you fought as Nero, only as Dante. Followed by a boring 15-minute savior boss, then a boss rush stage as Nero with a stupid dice game in between each one. Don't die, by the way. If you do, then you're doing the dice all over again. DMC2 made the first phase of the final boss just all the bosses combined together, which was cool, especially in Must Die mode where they all attack you at once. DMC3 made the boss rush interesting since you have the power to shorten it by only fighting the bosses you would need to solve the puzzle, which is great. If you're in DMC4, we just have a boss rush, and I sure do love those. It's a shame that this game was rushed, since Dante could have had his own campaign, which would have been excellent with gameplay this good. However, it's only a mere what if at this point. When the special edition was released, no real improvements were made to the actual campaign. Instead, we got more costumes, Virgil became playable, Trish became playable, and so did Lady. While all 3 of them play pretty well, but it's just not that worth it because they only have like 2 new cutscenes. But the real problem is that they just run through the same 20 repetitive stages that Nero and Dante did. So it just makes the repetition issue a lot worse. I didn't comment on Lucia's disc in DMC2, nor have I ever really cared to play as Virgil in DMC3, and that's because I felt satisfied with what I played as Dante in both games. Here, the game is already unfinished, so they just tacked extra stuff on top of that. Great. Thank goodness Bloody Palace is a thing. The survival mode is back and it's at its best. In the last 2 games, this lasted thousands of floors filled with randomly generated enemies. But here, Bloody Palace is only about 100 floors with the same enemies every time, so it always gives you something to look forward to when you finally overcome a stage that's been kicking your ass for a long time, and a soul-crushing defeat when you lose. After I first beat DMC4, I just spent months playing as Dante in this mode until I played the campaign again for this video. In fact, that leads me pretty well into the conclusion. Devil May Cry 4 is once my favorite game in the series, however my second and third playthroughs of DMC3 cemented that game as the best in the series and one of my favorites of all time. I now realize why I thought DMC4 was so good, and that was because I played Dante's Bloody Palace several times. I still haven't beaten level 20, honestly. It's there that Dante's perfected gameplay can really shine through. However, the actual campaign of DMC4 is pretty good, but just doesn't hold up to DMC3's standard with a story that goes through the motions, levels and bosses getting recycled across 2 characters, a few gimmicks, a bad boss rush, and an overall feeling of being rushed. As I said, I enjoy playing as Nero and I love playing as Dante, but playing the story mode of DMC4 can get kinda boring at times. This doesn't detract from the game too much, since I still love and recommend DMC4 to any action game fan since it's got such fluid gameplay and controls, but I have had more fun with the post-game than the main game itself. I hope DMC5 really improves upon what DMC4 was trying to do, since I see the ambition here, but whatever it was, probably Capcom, They got held back, and the overall game of Devil May Cry 4 had suffered from that.
What you do from here is your call.
Hey, Dante. Will we meet again?
So now we can discuss DMC, Devil May Cry, or just DMC for short. Ignoring the fact that this was one of the worst titles I've ever heard in a video game, I never bothered playing this one till right now. I mean, I've owned it for a few months, but I never cared to play it, so now I have the perfect excuse to do so. As is probably obvious by this point, this game is one of the most controversial pre-releases a video game has ever seen. I don't really care to go too in-depth on this, but basically DMC4 did not sell as well as Capcom had hoped, so they decided to radically change the series with Western developer Ninja Theory at the helm. Fans hated the new take on Dante from day one, and the developers childishly continued to strike back against the fan base, which just makes no sense.
Not in a million years.
All that achieves is stoking the flame. Eventually, the game hit store shelves in 2013, but it was remastered for the PlayStation 4 a few years later. This is obviously the version I'm going to look at. I mean, it's 60 FPS. An action game was released on PlayStation 3 in 2013 with 30 FPS. A damn joke when DMC4 pulled off 60 in 2008. But enough delay. DMC, Devil May Cry. The story is still the most hated thing about this game, and I completely agree. The basic rundown is that the evil corporation leader Mundus wants to find and kill Dante, but Dante is first found by Cat, who brings him to the Order, led by Dante's brother Virgin, as they work together to stop Mundus, who is defeated, and then Virgin wants to take over the world himself, gets beat, and then leaves the DLC pack as we wait for the sequel that never came. So right off the bat, the story is already extremely dry and predictable from the very beginning. I mean, for some reason, now Sparta is not the amazing devil hunter that defeated the demon hordes dozens of times. He was instead captured and tortured for all eternity, as his wife is an angel and not a human. With this new Dante and new Virgil being half angels, half demons, and that's the only thing that you need to kill a demon, I guess. But other than that, there really aren't that many surprises in this story. Since Mundus is evil, he gets beat. Anything he says to make himself seem less evil are worthless, since the heroes don't really care. Virgil is of course the final boss, since it's a DMC reboot with Virgil in it. Of course he's the final boss. Such a lame and obvious play from the start. I really had low expectations going into this scene, so that means I could be pleasantly surprised, like in this one part where Cat gets shot and captured. That was actually a good scene, but it's pretty rare form for this game's otherwise abysmal story. The basic story is boring and predictable enough, but the actual writing is where this completely falls flat in its face. They wanted to make Dante as edgy and badass as possible, so every good thing about his character from the previous games is pretty much gone. Dante has gone from being witty and fun-loving to being a sarcastic douchebag. For that reason, he's not entertaining to watch, he's just annoying. Like how he at first thinks the Cat and Virgil are spouting nonsense when he meets them, but this is only because of the fact that he is a douche, and that's the douchey thing to do. By trying to make him edgy, this of course leads to him spewing swear word after swear word. Of course, swearing is not something that bothers me personally, I used to do it in my videos all the time. However, again, there is no wit or creativity here. Dante just swears at the enemy in a really cringeworthy fashion.
Who invited you, fat ass?
You okay? That looked pretty nasty.
That? Nah, that was just a big fat joke. So you must be the secret ingredient. I'm your prom date, you ugly sack of shit. Fuck you! Fuck you! Fuck you! And I got a bigger dick.
Oh yeah, the delivery is awful. For the most part, the voice acting is pretty average, but Dante is just so bad. I mean, the lines that were supposed to be emotional would just be better delivered by a plank of wood.
We are brothers, after all.
But the cool edgy moments, as I just showed, are also really bad, and in turn they just become comedic. By the halfway point of the game, the dialogue stops being as cringy as it was at the start, but that isn't because the second half isn't cringy. It's because of the fact that the first half was so bad with it. I mean, the game opens with Dante at some kind of strip club, as he then takes two girls back to his trailer where they then have a threesome. As he wakes up completely naked and gets dressed, as the camera keeps finding ways for his crotch to not show. I was already laughing, and I'd only been playing for less than 10 minutes.
Get your filthy fucking claw off my trailer.
Like, is there anybody who thought this was unironically cool? Or thought this was so much better than that lame old Dante? Also, the ending was so bad. I mean, Mundus gets defeated in an unbelievably anticlimactic final boss fight, but then at the last mission, Virgil wants to take over the world and is completely shocked that nobody else wants to do the same. Yeah, no build-up, no payoff. Virgil is just like I said, shocked that nobody else wants to take over the world and is defeated by Dante in their first battle. I mean, we never saw him in combat throughout the whole game, and he's supposed to be a threat when he gets beat the first time? Dante also stands against him, despite not going through an arc at all in the game. Do I even need to tell you this has nothing on DMC3, where the stakes were so effectively raised with each and every boss fight? I mean, it just looks so effortless when compared to a failure of this magnitude. But honestly, that is really all there is to say on this crappy story. Characters are bland, game is incredibly try-hard with some lame voice acting from Dante, which just makes it an even harder pill to swallow. The fact that it's not getting a sequel only makes this worse, I might add, as any appeal left here is just not going anywhere, so I couldn't bring myself to care about most of these characters. I mean, we're only really talking about it to begin with since it shares the DMC name, but I would have been lost to the sands of time if it didn't. But to make matters worse, the story is also boring to look at. The game has some of the worst cinematography in the Devil May Cry series. The game used motion capture like the other games, but the camera work is just so uninspired for well over half the cutscenes. It's just A camera, B camera, A cam, B cam, A cam, B cam. Compare this to cutscenes from any other game in the series and you'll know what I'm talking about. There's hardly any action in cutscenes like Dante's office from DMC3, scaling down the tower, scaling up the tower, fighting Virgil, killing the Despair Embodied from DMC2, Dante challenging the Savior from DMC4. This game just doesn't do that. It just feels like I'm watching a really bad Uncharted story play out, not Devil May Cry. With really drab and dry visuals, and the game attempted to cover it up by having every level take place in this limbo dimension where the colors are saturated beyond belief. When you look past the abysmal story and the bad presentation of said story, is the game any good? Well, sort of. DMC, especially the version at 60 FPS, is not a bad action title by any means, when it is an action title. For the first half of the game, I just hated playing it so much. The reason is because this game has this need for platforming. Yeah, platforming in a Devil May Cry. You just want to shoot and slash, but see red hook, use red grapple. See blue hook, use blue grapple. It's just the most boring kind of gameplay you can imagine. There's hardly any skill with this, you just jump from platform to platform, oftentimes with spectacle happening around you, like an Uncharted game. But the worst parts of the game are by far the extended gameplay cutscenes where characters are just talking as we have to hold on the analog stick. It's just so boring, like nobody cares. Nobody likes sequences like this in video games. If you want to have cutscenes, have cutscenes. If you want to have gameplay. Don't make the first 5 minutes of Mission 5 just be running forward, listening to dialogue. By the second half of the game, there was a lot more action in this action game, and I actually enjoyed it a lot more. This combat just has nothing on DMC3 and DMC4, but for what it's worth, I wasn't not enjoying myself while slaying the enemies, since we can still use the Stinger, the Trillion Stab, juggling enemies in the air with your swords or your guns. It's pretty alright in that department. So just know this, if you pick up this game, you can expect an at best decent Devil May Cry, especially by the second half, but it's for that reason that I don't really need to focus on what this game does well since it's been done before and done better. So for that reason, I just want to focus on the new elements as to not repeat myself. But this is where the criticisms come in, mostly with the control layout. Launching enemies off the ground is now done with the circle button, as dodging is set to the L1 button. Personally, I found this to be way more buttons than they really needed, since I had no problem with the way it played before. Where things start getting annoying when you start unlocking alternate weapons. Using blue weapons requires you hold down L2, and red weapons require you hold down R2. Locking on is still done by holding R1, so you have to hold down 2 trigger buttons at the same time while using the face buttons to attack. This is what I mean. It's a really clumsy system that makes combat with the extra weapons extremely unsatisfying. I genuinely don't know what was wrong with pressing the L2 and R2 buttons once to switch weapons and guns was, but I can tell you that I don't like this arrangement they had in DMC. The combos with the 2 axe weapons are also not that fun to use anyway, with the fist attacks being my least favorite version of that in the series, which mostly stems from the controls, but even then the combo pool is limited when compared to the last 2 games, which is just an inherent downgrade, and that goes for every weapon in the game. The PS4 version promotes having rebalanced gameplay from the original release, and I can only imagine what that means, since already there are issues like blue enemies and red enemies only taking real damage from weapons of the corresponding color, which just limits the amount of creativity that you can put into your combos, hence why the loading screens have to show you how good their combat is. In previous DMC games, keeping enemies in the air via jump canceling took so much time and effort to master in all 4 games, but this game, giving you the grapple hooks that both take enemies to you and take you to the enemies, removes the skill in trying to get to enemies faster to keep the style meter up, and it also removes the skill of keeping them in the air, creating a combat system that just isn't that fun to master, but is pretty simple to get to grips with. When DMC 3 and 4 especially were simple to understand but took a buttload of practice to truly get right. Like I said though, DMC Devil May Cry is not a bad action title, especially when the game becomes more action focused in the second half, but I'm really not interested in giving away free points for creating a decent action title at its core since the genre was so well established at this point. I'm willing to admit that I had fun with DMC Devil May Cry. I mean, it wasn't a terrible game, but as a Devil May Cry game, I just didn't think it met the series' high standards. That is just if we're looking at the gameplay, of course. As I've hammered in, there's fun to be had and I totally recommend playing it since, like I said in the last video, always find conclusions and answers for yourself. I did not know what I was going to think of DMC Devil May Cry when I put it in the system, and I got an alright experience with numerous flaws like poor platforming, easy boss fights, bad balancing, and a truly atrocious storyline and cinematography. But it's not the worst game ever made, meaning that up to this point, I don't actually think there's been a bad Devil May Cry game. That's worthy of praise. But having said that, there hasn't been a perfect Devil May Cry either. Something has always held this franchise back, and I'm hoping that Devil May Cry 5 can finally give us that perfect action game that we know the series is capable of delivering. Especially now that the real Dante is back at the helm with the whole edgy phase done and over with. So that concludes my combo review of DMC4 and DMC Devil May Cry. Thank you all for watching, and here's hoping DMC5 lives up to the hype.
And I got a bigger dick.